you guys could give, they have 2 spots left on this fabulous field trip, so don't knock each other down on the way there. Okay. Louder? Oh, okay, maybe I wasn't talking directly into it, sorry. Is Annette here? There she is, okay. She's once again doing the Tillandsia project at her home. I believe you said you needed a few more volunteers? Okay. Okay. Okay, so she's pretty filled with people from the Bouquet of Thanks Committee, so that's going to... She's happy to take a wait list. We saw all sorts of people standing around, Maureen and Marilyn, organizing the members' field trip, members' garden tour in April. It's going to be fabulous out in Rancho Santa Fe, and the committee would like to encourage you to buy your tickets and to bring guests, particularly prospective members. Elaine and Jeannie. Here they come. Here comes Elaine. They're not going to be able to hear you. They're going to have to come up. Sorry,
Jeannie Smith and I are going to put on a workshop for our spring workshop for members, and it's called Backyardia, Roadsidia. And if any of you have ever taken classes from Rene Van Rems, he is big on Roadsidia, and that means you're going to forage from your yard. I'm going to forage from my yard. I have a big yard, and we're going to put together flowers. Now, here's a couple of things I just picked out this morning, and we're going to make really fun bouquets, kind of be out of the box, and we're going to provide the containers and material, and we will send information for those of you that sign up to you so you know what you need to bring. It'll be $25, 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. at my house in Point Loma, April 19th, and we're going to have a lot of fun and step out of the box, so I hope you can join us. We will be at the next meeting, and we already had 8 people sign up this morning, so we hope that you can join us. Okay, thank you.
that was good. Yeah. Janet Evans, where are? There she comes.
We're excited that Expressions is going to happen this year in the same format it did 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Next month, artists will display their creations, and floral designers are encouraged to choose one to interpret. Then on April 27th of April at our meeting, the meeting will be Expressions in Art and Flowers, and we hope we have a huge crowd to enjoy the artistry of our members. So please come sign up as an artist, a floral designer, or if you'd like to help on the committee. Thanks so much.
You received notices over this past month about 2 potential changes to the bylaws. The first one is regarding membership. A small group of people got together and talked about our membership process, and they are proposing this amendment. And it is that a candidate for membership may either be sponsored by one active or life member for acceptance by the membership committee, or apply without a sponsor to the membership committee after attending a meeting as a guest. Active and life members may sponsor more than one candidate for membership per club year, and new members shall be accepted only in the active class of membership. And I believe there's somebody from that group who's going to make that motion. Penelope. And a second? Kate. Okay, both of those were on the committee. And questions or comments, and I may ask them to come and help us with that discussion. Any questions, or does somebody want to call the question? Okay, we've got a call for the question. All those in favor, and you'll say aye. Opposed? It carries. The other motion went through the executive committee and the governing board, and so it stands as a motion before you to add the officer of president-elect this year during the nominating process. And the point of that is to allow for a succession plan every year. So a president-elect steps into the role and then comes onto the board. It is simply a succession piece. The motion stands before you from the governing board, and are there any questions or comments or discussion? Does somebody want to call the question? Okay, call the questions before you. All those in favor will say aye. Those opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. All right, we can move on to the most important part, our speaker.
Do you want to do these?
Oh, sorry. Raska, you do that.
Before we do that, we have to deal with the very important topic of the raffle. So I'm going to read out numbers. We have three prizes here. So number 1 is 384, 207, and 202. Wasn't that one? Okay. And 191. Any of those people, if you have one of those, come on up. First come, first serve. I'll let me read them again. 384, 207, 202, 191. Somebody has them deep in their handbags there. 211, 187.
Oh, good. Okay. Yay.
188. Can you help them pick? Can you help them pick one out? Okay. Do we have three people or just 2 people? Yay. Okay.
You're going to do the introduction. Are you doing the introduction? All right. All right, let me get this. David's all set to do that. As soon as you've done yours and Gordon starts, he's going to go.
Thank you, Susan. Is this the one that works? Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I imagine when our speaker, Gordon Hayward, first agreed to travel to La Jolla from his home in Vermont, he hoped for sunny California weather. So we extend a special thank you to him and to his wife, Mary, as well. Gordon Hayward is a nationally acclaimed garden writer, designer, and lecturer. For 25 years, beginning in 1979, he wrote for Horticulture Magazine, and he lectured in 9 of their lecture tours. He has published over 100 articles on garden design in a wide variety of publications in the United States and England, and he's given 420 lectures in 40 states for garden clubs, art museums, and botanical gardens. Gordon was a contributing editor at Fine Gardening Magazine for 6 years, and he is the author of 11 books on garden design, 2 of which have won national awards. We're in for a treat today as he reveals how fine paintings can inspire our garden design. Please join me in welcoming Gordon Hayward.
Thanks. Thank you so much for inviting Mary and me to come out to be part of your world out here. I wanted to thank you very much for the support of coming back to give a very similar lecture to one I gave here in 2008. I've been back to a lot of venues across the country, but never one where they asked me to come give the same talk. Having said that, this is a very different lecture. I've matured the idea. So if you were here in 2008, you're going to see a very different talk. First of all, I'd like to thank Jean Collins for arranging this visit, to Penelope West for her attention and greeting yesterday. Thanks to Ann Craig and Lacey Colmore and Elizabeth Hansen and Robin Sinclair for inviting Mary and me to see your gardens. And especially to Drex and Susan Patterson for their remarkable hospitality. And also, I'm not sure if Lily Walsh is in the audience, but Lily was one of my earliest clients. In 1985, I hung out my shingle, and I don't think it was a year or 2 later that Lily gave me a call. So to find myself back in Lily's presence, which Mary and I are seeing her garden this afternoon, is quite extraordinary, stretching over 35 years. I'd also like to introduce Mary. Could you stand up? This is my wife, Mary. She and I have been partners in this garden world since 1976. We bought our 1790 farmhouse in Westminster West, Vermont, not far from Putney, and have been developing our garden there ever since. The goal of my talk today is to explore some of the universal principles of composition with which you can take a new measure of your garden, as well as the paintings that hang in your house or in museums. These principles are useful, practical tools of design. By using them, can you only take the design so far. The living pulse of your garden must come from you, the designer, the person behind the garden, the person embodied in the garden. That's you. When you express yourself through these principles, when you are willing to step forward, to be vulnerable, to say, this is my garden, your garden comes alive, and it takes a form of rich autobiography. The corollary to this lecture's purpose is to give you new tools by which to more deeply appreciate paintings. The artist and the garden designer are employing the same universal elements of design to help them express themselves and to communicate their inner selves. When you next take a look at a work of fine art, remember that what you are looking at is a personal expression of a painter at a particular moment in his or her life. The artist is expressing his or her most interior, intimate, and charged emotions and perceptions. Give the artist your attention, your time, and your world will expand. Can we have the next slide, Mary? Next one. This then is a lecture about conscious seeing. about taking the time to see, to think about, to assess what it is you see. Research shows that museum goers spend anywhere from 3 to 8 seconds in front of a painting before they move on to the next. Slow down, see the garden, see the painting, think about what you are seeing. Be conscious of what you feel and what you think in the presence of that art. And if any of you want to be moved by an exhibit, go to the Rijksmuseum website in Amsterdam. They are about to open the most extraordinary Vermeer exhibit ever staged in this world. There are 27 of Vermeer's 35 paintings that are going to be on view, 1 painting per room. It's an extraordinary way. I mean, there may be some rooms with 2 or 3 paintings, but it's an extraordinary experience to go to that website. But what I would encourage you to do is something that I was asked to do. In 1963, I was 20 years old, living in New York City before going off to college that fall. And I took an art history course at Columbia University. And the professor asked us to go out into one of the museums in New York City and spend at least 2 hours in front of one painting. I spent 3 in front of a Mannerist painting in the Metropolitan, and I don't think I've ever returned fully from that experience. So if you follow that idea, if you challenge yourself to spend an hour in front of a painting in one of the art museums where you find yourself, it will change the way that you see the world. So in a way, this lecture is coming out of that experience. So what you're seeing here is a Matisse painting, and I think it's pretty interesting that Matisse chose a woman rather than a man to depict in this painting. Somehow I think women pay more attention and more closely pay attention to things. And if my wife Mary is any example, she is one of them. Okay, now this is a computer-averse person that you're dealing with here. So what we're looking at now is a painting by Frank Dumond. And this is about one of the very first things that we need to do when we compose an image. Now, I hasten to say that if you are living in an apartment and you don't have your own garden, you do visit your friends' gardens, and you do visit art museums. And this is as relevant to you as to anybody in here who is a gardener. So what we're seeing now is the first question you have to ask, and which is one of the first things that painters do, is what's the itinerary of the eye going to be in my painting? And so what Frank Dumond has done is to work out how he's going to, let's see now, the little red dot is not coming up. What am I, oh, there it is. So what Frank Dumond is doing, and this is coming out of, any of you been to the Old Lyme, the Florence Griswold Museum in Old Lyme, Connecticut? It was one of the centers of the painting world in the East Coast during the turn of the century and into the early 1900s. And Frank Dumond was one of them. And so the itinerary of the eye is one of the first things you want to look at when you look at a painting or a garden. That is, ask the question, what's the way in? How do I get into this experience? And oftentimes it's the lower left or lower right corner. So what Dumond has done is to use this gate and the lean of that gate to hold your eye. That's where your eye goes first. Then you see this yellowish, light yellowish band, which leads you to that path. And your eye comes up and starts to wander up in here, and then comes up into the sky. And notice that the shape of the sky is going to draw your eye across here, and then see how it narrows, and then it comes down through the sparkling of leaves, down to that post, which drives you right back to the beginning. And so that's the itinerary, that's the way in. So ask yourself, what's the way into a painting? Because a painter is thinking about that all the time. Okay, Mary. So this is not a picture to depress you. This is our garden, our plan for our garden that Mary and I are working on since 1983. And you want to ask yourself, what is the itinerary of our garden, of my garden, and how do we move through it? Because the sequence in which you take people through your garden creates a series of experiences which contrast one to the next. And when those are consciously conceived and thoughtfully conceived, people can feel the quality and the nature of each area of your garden by contrast to one that they've been through just previously. Do you see that? So what's going on here? Next slide, Mary. This is the itinerary of people who come to visit our garden. And the house is right here. This is a 1790 house. And the old-timers were paying a whole lot of attention to how they used the land and how they moved through it. So what Mary and I did was we came to an apple tree right here. It was a 100-year-old apple tree that was there when we got there. And what we did was to tie a string by the front door of the house, and we tied that string to the apple tree 220 feet into the garden. Every line in the garden, every straight line in the garden is parallel or perpendicular to that string. And the result is a coherence, a feeling that everything is kind of working together and has been conceived. If any of you have been to Sissinghurst, you know that Sissinghurst, when Vita Sackville West and Harold Nicholson were developing it, they were very conscious of how you moved from space A to B. Now keep in mind, this is the same thing as your house. That is, think about the experience of guests arriving at your front door. What's their first experience? What's their second? What's their third as they get to your sitting room? What's the nature of life in the sitting room? Then you're all invited into the dining room. You're into a fourth room. And then the lady of the house disappears into the kitchen and you think, oh, I'll go help her, and you go out into the kitchen. So you've had 5 experiences. And each of those is in a very different space with purpose, right? The kitchen has got a very specific purpose. Ditto the garden. Ask yourself, what's the purpose? What's the role of this particular area of the garden? So what people do when they arrive is they come deep into this garden. And what we're doing now is juxtaposing gardens of different qualities, just as you juxtapose different experiences in your house. So when you get home, ask yourself, what's the nature of space A when my guests come? B, C, what's the difference? Are there clear differences? So we come through here, but then we introduce curves as we move into areas that call for curves. And so can you see that what we're doing is drawing this whole garden together through itinerary. Okay, next slide. So this is the view from our front door. So get your mind at your front door now. Open the door in your mind and look out and see what you see. And what many of us see is driveway. And what can you do to tone that driveway down so that when you're standing by the front door, there is that feeling of welcoming people into your garden? So what we're doing in this picture here is that Mary and I have created an entrance into our garden. That is, the driveway is semi-public property. The UPS guy can drive on that as well as you can if you've come to visit the garden. But however, the minute you walk between these pots and these 2 upright U's, you feel that you're entering a new space. You see that? And that feeling of entering is a crucial part of every garden as you arrive at a certain section of the garden. The other point is to how do you create foreground and background? Do you see how we've repeated this U in the foreground and the background? So what that does is to link foreground to background and give you a clear indication of where you're meant to go. Okay. This is looking back at the house. And so what we're doing here is we've got a stone walkway through this little crabapple orchard, and people turn around and look back. Whenever you're visiting a garden, always look back where you've been before moving on to the next section, so that you're doubling your experience by turning around and seeing what's the relationship of where I've been to where I'm going. The other part of this image is that I grew up on an orchard in northwestern Connecticut. My father started in 1929. My brother's taking it over, and his son is taking it over. So I grew up in a world of apple trees, pear trees, and peach trees in beautiful rows with a view 20 miles east to Avon Mountain over Hartford, Connecticut. And the result of that was that I was, in a way, I was growing up in a work of art. It was something that resulted from a great deal of work on my father's part to plant all these fruit trees. But they were so beautiful that I think that's the other thing in my experience is growing up in a very beautiful place. Having said that, we worked like crazy, which is why I'm not there. But my brother is. The other part of it is that Mary grew up on a farm in the North Cotswold Hills, just 2 miles outside of Chipping Campden in Gloucestershire. And so she has that experience of growing up in the most exquisite lands. It's called an area of outstanding natural beauty. Not one thing can be changed in that landscape without going through a bureaucratic nightmare. So it's all preserved, and it's hundreds of years old. The other part of the fact that Mary and I are both sons of farmers is that we know what work is all about. And so our garden is the result of a great deal of work. Okay, next slide, Mary. So start with straight paths. The first thing to do when you're designing a garden is to develop the paths. And that's one of the early places to start when you're going to appreciate a garden you're visiting. So this is Lockwood DeForest designed for a California garden from probably the 60s. And what he's done is to create a main spine that draws you into the garden that comes right off of that door. And so the straight line is not something I think you probably see in the gardens around here. What we saw yesterday in 4 Gardens, it's a lot of curving paths. And so this maybe is not as relevant to you. But what that straight line does is to create an absolutely intimate link between house and garden. Okay, next. Now this is a painting by Richard Schmidt, who is a nationally known artist. And the question that Richard Schmidt talked to me about one time is how he starts a painting. That is, how does he create an itinerary for his eye, not necessarily yours. So you see that the focus of this is the Russian doll. Can you see her? Can you see the Russian doll? Next slide, Mary. This is Richard's first gesture on the canvas. It's right here. And do you see what he did? He starts in the lower left corner, right where Frank Dumont started his painting. And what he did is to create this S-curve. Can you see it? And here's the Russian doll. It isn't even there yet, but that's the idea, that he's going to lead your eye into the painting through that S-curve. And so his next gesture is to start to fill in the Russian doll. Then the next one, but notice that the curving path to the eye is still there. And then now he's into his painting. And once he gets into the painting, you can then wander around in it. So when you're looking at a piece of art that you've got at home, see if you can find that itinerary of the eye. It's the starting place for the exploration of the eye. Okay, Mary. The curving paths, which is much more amenable, it seems to me, to the style of gardening here in your area, just because of the nature of the land, the smaller areas of garden for gardening space. What Roberto Burle Marx, who's a Brazilian, did was to create curvilinear gardens, that is, small gardens that have loads of curves. Do you know Brasilia? In Brazil, he was the designer, the landscape architect for Brasilia. And what he was doing was developing these just remarkable rhythms that he created that you can't do with straight lines. So if you're gardening with curved lines, pay attention to them. Why do they curve the way they do? How do they move people into that space? There's one other point I'd make here, and that is notice that he's got a straight path going right out of his studio. So while he's working on curves, perhaps in his professional work, he's also creating paths. And I'm going to mention one theme, one subject that I'm going to bring up later, which is theme and variation. And theme and variation, do you know da-da-da-da? You know where you heard that before? Where is it? Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Every painter is doing the same thing that musicians are doing. That is, that one thing they're doing is theme and variation. I gave this lecture at the Phipps Conservatory in Pittsburgh years ago, and a woman came up to me and said, now you have to do one about music and composition. All the same principles apply. So what Roberto Burle Marx is doing here is, you see how he's got the 4-inch square tiles? But then he's treating them differently. Sometimes he's repeating the pattern within the 4-inch square. Sometimes he's changing the color. But notice that there's another theme and variation, which is blue and white. And so coherence is the result of that. But the major thing that he declares in his work is compose. That is, what you're doing as a garden designer and a gardener is composing images for people. And so you're always asking, what is the impact that this visual garden that I'm creating having on other people? And are those areas different? Do they explore different sides of who I am? Okay. So this is a Roberto Burle Marx landscape design for Burton Tremaine. This was in the 50s in Santa Barbara. The house is in blue. Here's the garage, here's the driveway. You see the driveway coming in here. Here's the swimming pool. And you see how that's an abstract painting? It could well be a work of art right there. That is, that what he's doing is showing the interrelationship of curves, one to the next, and how all of those are going to create a different mood and a different feeling. And I think this is way closer to your style of gardening than the straight lines. And so what you've got is, your question is, how do my different sized beds and gardens relate one to another, but then also how do they compose a whole idea? And my argument in this lecture is that the whole idea comes from your heart, from your past. I suspect that not many of you grew up on a farm thinning peach trees. But what you did do is you've got this whole past behind you. Your grandmother was a gardener, your mother was a gardener, your father was maybe. How do you embody all of that past that you bring, and only you bring to your life, into that garden to give it heart? Okay, next slide, Mary. So here's an example of a Burle Marx curvilinear design. And you can see how he is creating mood and a sort of almost wild sense of curvilinear feeling, but then he's also playing with the material on the ground. So a big part of this is also, what is the material you use for your paths? And do you vary those paths, but do you vary them in such a way that they don't get busy and you use too many materials? So one thing you could do when you go home is ask yourself, what have I got on the ground? What have I got people walking on? And what is the shape of those paths vis-a-vis the beds? Okay, Mary. So here's an example of what Mary and I did with this idea. We had a cottage in Blockley in Gloucestershire. Have any of you seen Father Brown, the murder mystery? That was set in Blockley. And from our table here, we could see Father Brown's, the church tower in Blockley. So this was the garden that we purchased. And what was it, Mary? Well, it was about 22 years ago. Right, 2018 we bought it. And what we realized that we had is a perfect garden for drying laundry. That you could put a cushion on that and sit on that, but we didn't quite see what the point was, because there's nothing going on. There's nothing to say, this is my garden, or this is something I'd love to share with you. So this is what we did with it. And what we did with it is we composed. That is, that we started with the idea of the circle and the part thereof. Can you see it? The circle and the part thereof. So the first thing is, this was a quarter circle in the L of the cottage, right here. So we took that quarter circle, which was already there, and we put a curving path, which is part of a circle. Then we get up, stepping up onto this area, and we built a stone retaining wall that is in a complete circle. Then we put a band of pea stone around the base of that wall, a band of tiles, and then another paved a circle in the middle. And we made a mistake of buying a hexagonal table. So clearly that should have been a circle, and you'll see in the next slide we redressed the problem. But can you see the circle here? So in other words, the circle is the core of the composition. That is, how have we united all the parts into a whole feeling? And then we, of course, have planted outside of the circle. So next slide, Mary. So this is what we had when we sadly sold this place, given the uncertainties of Brexit, because we were renting this out by the week, and Brexit had some very dire consequences, we felt. But do you see here we've changed the table to a perfect circle. And so what happens is that you're walking into a space that feels coherent. It holds together. And the background, one of the other things that we use is that it's called theme and variation. That is, we've got the theme of the field stone, of the Cotswold stones, which we pick up in the existing walls in the wall of that little building. So ask yourself, what materials have I got in the garden? And am I using them or overusing materials? That is, to draw too much attention away from my garden. The other point here is, I was an English teacher for about 15 years before I got into garden design. Ask yourself, what prepositions have I built into my garden? That is, every preposition is a different experience. Can you see them? Every one of those prepositions it gives you an added feeling of an experience. So when you walk across, you step off that little quarter circle landing, you walk across the stepping stones up into this area, into the garden, onto a chair, and sit at the table. Every one of those prepositions is another experience. Is this making sense? Because it's a very interesting question to ask yourself. Okay, Mary. All right, so then the next thing I would encourage you to do, having looked at the paths and the overall structure, is your windows. Windows are framing devices. Stand in front of every window that looks out into your garden when you get home and ask yourself, how am I doing? What's it like to stand at this window as opposed to that window, as opposed to that window? That is, the house and the garden need to be speaking to each other through line, form, mass, all the things that I'm talking about. So what Childe Hassam has done here is to use this open sash of windows to focus your eye out into the garden, to create this feeling of inside and outside. Every one of the panes of the glass is a frame looking out into your garden. This was what we looked at when we looked out our window of our cottage in Blockley. And you can see that there's a perfect relationship, just because I stood where I was standing with the camera, admittedly, but still that object outside links inside to outside. So you've got this feeling of unity. So check out your windows. Okay, Mary. This is our view from our bedroom window. So once you've looked at all the gardens, or all the windows downstairs, go upstairs and see what's going on out there. Is there anything you can do to improve the view from those windows? Okay, Mary. We took this picture at Highgrove when Prince Charles was the prince, but he's now the king. But this is what he did with windows. That is, well, I'm not sure he did it, but his designer did. And what he's doing here is relating these two windows in whatever room that is to the garden and vice versa. So that link between your windows and your garden are a very big deal, because what you're doing is linking house to garden. Okay, Mary. Some of you may know Philip Johnson. He was a very important architect from New Canaan, Connecticut. He did a lot of the major skyscrapers in New York City. But I thought you might be enjoying this picture. What he did, this is his glass house. Do any of you know this house at all in New Canaan, Connecticut? It's one of the iconic buildings of architecture from the 60s and 50s. So what Philip Johnson did to link inside to outside is he bought a painting that had a tree line in it, and he positioned it in such a way that when you were standing looking at the painting, the line of the trees here hooked up with the line of trees outside. And so there was this beautiful link between the two worlds. Okay. Now, the question that I started the talk with is, what's the way in? How does the painter draw you into his painting? So Eugene Boudin in this Villefranche, can you see what's going on here with the huge triangles? That is, that he's got a triangle in this area, another one in this area, and the brick walkway is the thing that draws your eye into the painting. Can you see it? That brick walkway just carries you right into it. And what he's got is a woman in a dark black coat and a little child in a red jacket. And those two draw your eye in. So ask yourself, what is drawing my eye and my guest's eye into the garden? What's pulling them in? This is the garden of the Olmsted brothers created up in Tacoma, Washington. And these two are both interested in the same thing. That is this narrowing as you look into your garden. And what the Olmsted brothers did is to pile up shrubs on either side. Do you see how it's almost claustrophobic? If you imagine yourself walking in that space, it's very, very tight. So what they did is two things. They created a straight path rather than a curved path, so there's a promise of water, light, openness, but they also used a bench. Can you see the bench? And that bench is a promise to the garden visitor that there's comfort at the end of what might feel like a slightly claustrophobic and rather towering experience as you walk through it. So this is an example of the power of the straight path. Okay, Mary. And what Van Gogh is doing in this entrance to the park is the same thing that Phyllis Reese and later Penelope Hobhouse did at Tintinhull in southern England. That is that, first of all, what the artist has done. Now remember, my first question for you is, what's the way in, right? That's pretty clear, isn't it, in both of these images? What's the way in? So Van Gogh brings your eye in, but notice that you have to skip over this panel here. So it's almost as if this section of the road is outside the painting, and you step over this line and you're in the painting. So now the next question is, how do you create a sense of depth? If you're looking down a straight path, how do you help people understand depth and distance? And one of the ways that painters do it is that they have a person, the human figure, in the foreground, the middle ground, and the background, going from large to small. You see it? And so Van Gogh has created a sense of depth by using the human figure. And what Penny Hobhouse and Phyllis Reese did is that they did the same thing, I think, that Van Gogh did, but there's a 5-bar gate at the far end. And so the 5-bar gate, I bet we've all stood next to a horse paddock with our arms resting on the top of a 5-bar gate. And so we know what object, because we know of the size of the object, we know how far it is. So we can read it comfortably. So every major view in your garden, ask yourself, how am I helping my visitors read distance and depth? Making use of objects of known size. So the other thing going on here is the way that either side of the path is speaking to the other side. So what Van Gogh has done is to create unity. First of all, he repeats this railing. Then he repeats these trees of similar foliage and type. And then diminishing the width of the path, so the result of it is that you feel depth in a painting. So that's a wonderful question to ask of paintings hanging in your own house. How do you feel depth? How do you read depth? And the illusion that the painting is going back like your circle with the light that looks as though it's going back 50 feet. So what's going on here is that when you've got a straight path, you can then start designing either side of it by repeating certain plants and then starting to introduce variety. Okay, Mary. So this is what Mary and I have done with one of the paths in our garden. And how do we create depth? People know how big a chair is. People know basically how big an arbor is. So one of the things you want to do is to use furniture as a way to help people understand distance and depth in a garden. And the result of that is oftentimes comfort, that people feel comfortable. Okay, Marianne. So this is a painting by André Derain called La Route. And this is about where to place chairs in a garden, because it's the same as where painters place easels. And André Derain has written about this particular painting. And what he said was that he started with his easel up in here. And you can see that if he put his easel there, that village which he's interested in painting is on the landscape. You see it? Whereas here, what is it? In the landscape. Right? That your eye has to trip over the shadows of 3 trees, the trunks of trees. It has to get beyond the foliage of these trees. And so this little village in there feels intimate, within, welcoming, as opposed to seeing the village on. And so this has a huge implication for your garden. That is, how do you draw people within? How do you make people feel in a garden rather than on a landscape? So what Mary and I have done is that we have a chair. I took this photograph from a chair. I was sitting in the garden, and you can see how appealing that is. So when it comes to siting furniture, get a lightweight aluminum chair and walk all through your garden carrying the aluminum chair and sit in all sorts of different places. And you will be amazed if you spend a couple minutes looking at what you see from that new chair position, that maybe all these years you'd missed a really good place to put a chair. And this has a lot to do with views. The other thing going on here is the sky. Can you see how Derain has used the sky? Look how it comes down and then splays out over the village, almost as if it's protecting the village, embracing that village. So the way that trees manipulate view of, in your case, the Pacific Ocean, but also the landscape around it. And trees can focus your attention in very specific ways. Okay, Mary. Now, the power of the diagonal path. I don't think any of you, I suspect, have a diagonal path in your garden, but when you go to a garden that has one, you will see a path of serious force. That is, the diagonal has got a line to it that is just irresistible. It just forces its way through the other rectangular quality of a garden. So Anthony Paul in Sussex in England has got all this vertical, or this horizontal and vertical straight line path, but then he drives this diagonal right through it, and it's quite something. It's almost a little intimidating. It's got such force. And Van Gogh did the same thing, in that what Van Gogh is doing, oh, let me ask you, do you see the itinerary of the eye in this painting? Do you see where he wants your eye to start? The lower right corner, right? Where the path starts. Then you follow that line, and if you follow that line, what happens to it? Do you see how it bounces off that fence, goes up into this line of cypresses, comes all the way back, then it follows this one down, follows the ladder back, and you're back here. Now you're in the painting. And then your eye begins to circulate around the painting. This is really a wonderful thing to pay attention to when you're looking at art. Okay, Mary. So the curving path is doing quite a few things. This is a path in our garden, and this path curves out of sight. You don't know where you're headed. So a curving path has the power to draw you in, but not show you the end. You don't know where you're going. And so a curving path has got a mystery built right into it. And so think about how your curving paths carry you through and into your garden, and do they feel comfortable? Now what Renoir is doing here is that he uses this band of chartreuse grasses to draw your eye in from the lower right corner. It comes to the human figure, goes up into this tree, comes across the sky, and down here, and now you're in the painting. And the result of that is that your eye then can explore all of this, just as people can explore this. So the curving path builds mystery. Okay, Mary. So what Dan Kiley was a very important landscape architect. Do any of you know Paris, the city of Paris, well at all? Right past the Arc de Triomphe is an area called La Défense. Some of you may know it, but Dan Kiley designed that whole area of Paris in the 60s and early 70s. But he said the curving path leads to the mystery beyond. That is, when you put a straight path in the garden, you know where you're headed. You put a curving path in and you don't. And those two play very different roles in engaging the imagination of the people visiting your garden. So in this redwood grove, the designer Jonathan Plant created a whole series of curving paths to draw you in, just as Martin Johnson Heade did here. Now the other thing that you can play with is that you take an object of known size, such as these hay mounds, and you reduce them in size as you move along that path, so as to create the illusion that you're moving a greater distance than you actually are. So you're playing around with sort of visual trickery. But the other thing here is objects of known size. That is, when you put objects in your garden and they are of known size, that is, we know how big a chair is, roughly. What we don't know how big is a pot, let's say, or many objects. So by using objects of known size, you can help people read distance. Okay. Now, this is the split path, and I bet there are 28 paths in this garden, in your gardens, that split. That is, where you come along a path and then you have a choice, and you can either go right or left. And that's fun, because what you're doing is engaging the imagination of the visitor and your family and yourself. Is which way shall I go? And that's a fun conundrum to have to answer. So what Van Gogh is doing here is he's splitting the image. That he's got the yellow house where he and Gauguin were for a while, until they had fisticuffs. What Van Gogh has done is to give you two choices. But do you see how he set up a hierarchy? There's one major path to the right and a minor path to the left. And so he clearly wants your eye to go to the right, but he still offered you a difference. So do you see how he defines depth? Human figures shrinking in size as they go into the distance. The other thing that is happening here is this sky. I was at the Metropolitan years ago, and I heard a docent giving a tour through the gardens, through the paintings, and she said to them, if you're ever unsure of what a painting means or how it's put together, ask the question why. Just ask the question why. And so the question is, why that sky? Now remember, the research shows that people stand in front of a painting in a museum for 3 to 8 seconds. That's a travesty. So give yourself 2 minutes, 5 minutes to ask yourself the question why. Why has Van Gogh created that? I've not read anything that explains that, but I do think, could it be that the smoke coming out of that locomotive is very similar to that sky? And is he painting this by way of, in part, saying the locomotive is going to change everything for the worse? That is, this quiet little village of Aix-en-Provence is going to clearly change because of that locomotive. I don't know, that's a thought I have. But that's the kind of question you could ask yourself. Now on the right is Princess Greta Sturz's garden in Normandy. She's got something like 8 acres of garden. A friend of ours, Greta Witztum, invited Mary and me to see this garden. And we arrived, and there were about 12 of us, and she brought out a 5-gallon bucket, turned it upside down, stood up on the bottom of the bucket and said, would you like the tour in French, German, English, did she have Dutch? English, French, German, Dutch, or Spanish? Whereupon we all felt completely inadequate and said, oh, English, please. And off we went with her into this 8 acres of garden, and there is not one straight path in the whole thing. And it was one of the most extraordinary garden visiting experiences I've ever had. And here's what she did. She's got curvilinear beds, which means curvilinear paths. So this is a lot like your gardens here, I think. But what she's done is to set up a hierarchy. She's got a wide path and a narrower path. So which are you drawn to? The wider path. And for those of you who are nonconformists, you would go to the narrower path. But my point is that you've got a choice, so you have to make a choice. That is, you're engaged in a very different way from a straight path. So you walk down this path, and you get maybe 40, 50 feet in, and there's another choice you have to make. And at one point, we were walking through this garden, and we came upon one of the most extraordinary garden images. I will never forget it. There is a 10 by 12 foot tarpaulin tarp on the plastic tarp, and it is covered with rose flowers that have been deadheaded from rose bushes. It was that thick. And half the roses I would never have cut off. They were in perfect condition as far as I could see. So the two gardeners had spent all that day deadheading roses, and there's one of the most beautiful tarp full of refuse we have ever seen. We got further into this garden, we had no idea where we were. We had no idea where the house was. How were we going to get out of it if Greta weren't leading us? You see what I'm getting at? Is the power of the curving path can create this level of mystery where what you have to do is give in to the garden. Okay, Mary. Now, framing views. This is a very big deal because if you live in La Jolla, the whole deal is the view. right? So how do you take the most advantage of that view of the ocean or wherever it is that you might have your house? So framing views is a very big deal. But again, it means that you're going to have to stop and look and spend time. So you take a look at your view, and what you're learning from this painting by Washington Allston is that the main view is of this magnificent stone mountain. And so that's clearly what he wants you to see. So what he's doing is placing a vertical pair of trees to frame a vertical view. So your question is, do I want to frame a vertical view of the ocean or a horizontal view? And how am I going to do that? And many times the neighbor's house, which was built 3 years ago and changed your whole view, maybe what you have to do is go vertical rather than horizontal. So then the question is, how do you frame that view? Notice in this painting also that there is a dominant framing device and a subordinate one. And do you see how the subordinate one frames the distant mountain and the closer one frames the closer mountain? Now there's one other thing going on, and this is the person in this painting. What is the role of that person? It's an object of known size that helps you understand scale. And that's oftentimes missing in gardens. That is, we need to build into our gardens objects of known size so that we can read scale. So what Mary and I have done is we put this armillary sphere in our garden, and we've got the arbor down here with chairs in it. So we have two objects that we roughly, all people who visit the garden know what the size of them is, and therefore they can read the garden. You see that? And so where you put these chairs and tables is a very big deal. Okay, Mary. Tree trunks, think of the trees in your garden. And ask yourself, when you're sitting in your garden or sitting up at the patio or even sitting in your house, are the trees framing views that are of value to my garden? Or have I lost or missed the opportunity to frame a view through those trunks? So Russell Page at the PepsiCo headquarters, have any of you been there in Purchase, New York? It's just outside of New York City. Russell Page created this garden. It's the PepsiCo Corporation headquarters, and it's one of the great gardens in the East. And what Page did was to have the gardeners prune these trees up to frame the view of the Alexander Calder stabile out in the distance. So stand by every tree in your garden and look out at just the trees. Spend a whole hour just walking from tree to tree to tree and see, would they be better pruned up higher? Should I put a shrub under a certain tree to reduce the amount of trunk that I'm showing? What's the role of trunks? Gustav Klimt is saying that what his interest is in the foliage, but still he lets your eye go through. Okay. This is in Somme Sound in Maine. Have any of you been up to Acadia National Park in the Northeast Harbor and some of those? Well, this is right near, this is Somme Sound, and what Patrick Chazet did, and this is so, and Pat gave me a tour of this garden that he designed, and he said, I came out onto the deck one day, and there was this tree with all these branches, and he had Felco number 2s in his back pocket, and he cut a circle. Isn't that beautiful? And there is the whole of Somme Sound framed in that circle. And that might be really fun for you to explore the views that you have of the ocean. This is my view of the Pacific. What a thing to have in your garden. So pruning the branches of trees and being aware of their role in your garden is a really interesting thing to play with. Now, what George Innes is doing here is something very similar. That is that he's probably chosen to paint there may have been more branches on this than appeared, but what he wanted to do was to create foreground, background, but then to use those branches, as Pat Chazet did, to frame segments of the sky. And so what is going on with foreground, background in this painting? Do you see how the color white in the painting is operating? You see it? There's the white of the woman's cap, then there's the white of the house and the white of a shed or something out there. That triangle shows expansion. That is, you start narrow and then you widen out. So what's going on, and what I'm arguing in this whole lecture, is that you are a painter. You, as a garden designer, you are painting with plants. And if you choose these compositional elements, you'll have so much fun developing your garden. Okay, Mary. Now, this is foreground and background, and this is a real problem for American gardens, because what we so often do is we go out into our lawn and we say, I think I'll put a bed there. And so you dig a sort of shape in the lawn, and first of all, it may or may not relate to anything else around it, but the other thing that's going on is that you are simultaneously creating foreground, background. You got my idea? So any garden that where you can stand in front of one garden and see another garden behind it is a confusing experience, because there's one idea is colliding with a second idea. So what Mary and I did in our garden, this is a very obvious example, is that I pruned this. This is 34 years of pruning you're looking at here. And I know what I'm doing with a pair of pruners because I grew up helping my father starting at age 10 in 18 acres of fruit trees. So what I did was I wanted to create horizontality in that branching. And then we plant vertical hedge. And so the horizontal and the vertical are defining one another. So there's another thing to pay attention to. Walk your whole garden looking at nothing but horizontals and verticals. This is great fun if you're into it. So this works all year long. Here it is in the fall, and this is this 110-year-old apple tree made vertical with my Felco number 2s, seen against the verticality. Sorry, did I say I meant horizontal with the verticality of these other trees. So that vertical horizontality is another thing you ought to check your whole garden out. Okay, Mary. Now, foreground, background. When you've got a complex foreground, you need a simple background. And so what Edmund Grayson is doing, and this is another old Lyme, Connecticut painting, is that you see how all the complexity is in the foreground, but this panel of lawn in the background enables you to read those flowers clearly. So check your whole garden to see if foreground is emphasized by simple background. It's a really fun thing to explore. Okay, Mary. So this is our main border. It's about 120 feet. I dug this whole area, both sides. It's about 90 feet long and about 12 feet wide, and there are 2 of those. And I dug the whole thing with my grandmother's spading shovel. And my grandmother was not 6'5". So I am bent all over, but I knew Gran was watching me, and I had to use her shovel. I think about that every time in the garden. But what's going on here is that we have this complex foreground. Can you see the meadow here? Next slide, Mary. The background of that garden is this meadow. We've got a 30-acre meadow. We own 10 acres of it. But what we've got here is a very simple background. So what you need to ask yourself of every garden area is what's in the background. Does the background take too much away from the foreground? Should I hedge it off? Well, how should I deal with this issue of foreground and background? Okay, Mary. Now, the house as background. I think as I have Mary and I have been driven around. Every house that I think we've seen has plantings right up to the street. But that's not true in suburban America by and large. That is that people have got this notion that an acre and a half of lawn going down to the street with a house plonked at the top of the lawn is the way to go. And the result of that is the house is on, not in. And there is a huge difference. And one of it is personality, warmth, welcome. So look at what Monet is doing, painting this house. First he wants you to see the duck pond. And it's so charming. And the light that's reflecting off of this pond water is just draws you in. And then your eye just inevitably goes up. And then you see the person. And what is the role of the person? Is to explain scale and the size of the house. Put your finger up and cover that person, and you only have the most basic of understanding of how big that house is. Same with your house. That is that this is a garden in Washington, D.C. Do you see that this house is within, not on? And the result is the preposition within is welcoming, it's inclusive, it's drawing people with warmth and feeling, and it's an adventure to walk from the sidewalk to go, you see the prepositions? Off the sidewalk, onto the landing, up the steps, under the trees, along the path, up the steps and into the front door. And every one of those prepositions is an experience. If there's nothing but lawn out there, there's no experience, there's no feeling of arrival. Okay. Now, this is a very big deal, I think, for your gardens out here. That is, when do I release my garden into the atmosphere? And the atmosphere is so extraordinary out here, and so big, and so grand. And there's the ocean out in the distance. That's a rare thing to be able to work with. But what Monet is doing here is that he's interested in this. Now, start piling up what you're learning from this talk, because can you see the itinerary of the eye? You see where it starts in lower left, and your eye is drawn up that panel of chartreuse grass. Do you see how scale is established by the introduction of that human being? Put your finger up and cover that human being, and you no longer have a clear read of size and scale. But what's going on here is that he is drawing your eye lower left into upper right or into the center, and then it's released into the atmosphere. And so walk your whole garden asking yourself, when do I release my garden into the atmosphere? That is, when you might walk under a tree and then you walk out from under the branches and the whole view just explodes. And take advantage of that. Be aware of that as you move through your garden and when you're releasing your garden into the atmosphere. Okay, Mary. This is a painting Mary and I own. Brian Sweetland is a painter. He passed away a few years ago, but this is his celebration of West Rupert, Vermont. And you can see how he is so fascinated by clouds. And pay attention to the use to which painters put clouds. But notice also that the farmhouse in the lower right corner, can you see it all okay? Notice that it is not completely visible. You don't see it sitting on the landscape, you see it sitting in the landscape. By not showing the foundation of the house and the lawn it sits on, you get the feeling that it is within, it's part of the landscape. And that's really what Brian Sweetland was painting, is people in relation to the landscape of southern Vermont. And it's quite an extraordinary painting. But the other point I think here is to appreciate clouds. Mary, what's the name of the Cloud Society? Look it up on the internet. What was his name? That's okay. Gareth Prater Penny. And he's a totally eccentric Brit. And he has set up a website, and every morning Mary gets the cloud of the day appearing on her computer. And they're from, are you on it? Oh, right. And every day there's a different cloud. Yeah. They're all over, from all over the world. And it takes a British eccentric to pull this off. His mother is still trying to figure out how he's going to make a living. Having said that, he's got 90,000 people signed up at $30 a year, so he's doing fine. But pay attention to clouds. You have got such a gift where you live, to the clouds. And have a cloud viewing party someday and just sit out there and just marvel at where you live. Okay, Mary. So this is one area of our garden. We own this 10-acre field, and what we did years ago, we planted 3 oak trees out in the middle of the field, and we put a bench under it, and I mow a perfect circle under those trees, and then I mow this path. And so when the garden gets altogether too much, which happens pretty frequently, we retreat to the 3 oak trees and sit quietly and listen to nature quietly carrying on. But can you see the power of that space to watch clouds? It's something that we just don't take the time to do. And this is, I think, another subject of this lecture is take the time to see. We don't do it. And it is so reassuring, so renewing. And if COVID taught us everything, is we've got to slow down. And we've got to look at the roses. You know, we're in constant motion. And I would think that a view of the Pacific is a good place to slow down. Okay, Mary. Now, this is, do you know the Meta headquarters up in Menlo Park? The Facebook headquarters? This is a building that a neighbor of ours, Raina Dignord, Raina worked in our garden in Vermont when she was a girl, maybe a 16, 18-year-old. She's gone on to become one of the nation's great landscape architects. And she worked with Frank Gehry on the design for the layout of these buildings at the Meta headquarters. And what she did is she was flying from San Diego up to San Francisco, and she saw the line of the mudflats, and that gave her the idea to offset all of these buildings. This is 1.5 miles from here to there. And Raina designed, and over the last 10 years has been installing this garden, one of the great modern gardens of America. And this is a place I photographed when we were touring this with Raina last year. And what she's done here is released her garden, this 1.5 mile long garden, into the atmosphere. So ask yourself, where have I released my garden into the atmosphere? Where can I sit and feel that I don't see anything, let's say, but the Pacific, or whatever it might be that you want people to see. But this releasing the garden into an atmosphere is an extraordinary concept. Okay. Oh, by the way, Raina is the landscape architect for the Triton project down at the university expansion project down here in San Diego. Now, this is about positive and negative space. I have about, have I got about another 10, 15 minutes? Am I okay? Okay. This is about positive and negative space. You have seen the FedEx sign 1 million times. Have you seen the arrow between the E and the X? Have you seen the right-facing arrow between the E and the X? You see it? Now this is you're gonna curse me, because every time a FedEx truck goes by, you're gonna try to see the arrow, and you're gonna plow into somebody in front of you. But I was lecturing, Mary and I were in Bedford, New York, and we were lecturing, and we were staying with an advertising executive, and I asked him, do you know who created the arrow in FedEx? And he said he did. And he woke up, this gentleman woke up in the middle of the night, and there before his eyes was the arrow between the E and the X. And of course, it's the key to the whole logo, because the arrow is saying, we'll get that package right there. So what he's done is something very similar to Ivan Chermayeff. Ivan Chermayeff lives in northwestern Connecticut. I met him once years and years ago. He did the red O in mobile. You know the red O? So Ivan Chermayeff did this. This was the logo for the Jacob's pillow. And what I'm getting at is positive and negative space. The dancer is positive space. The white is negative space. But because of the way that he's placed the dancer, the white space is saying to you, look how high the dancers at Jacob's pillow jump. Do you see it? If he had put that black figure down and in the middle, it would have meant nothing. But this is saying, this is a dramatic place to go to watch dance. And so my point is, the negative space, the lawn in your garden is the negative space. And it should bear a relationship and a shape to the beds. And America has been convinced to take a hose out into the lawn, create a curvy bed, dig up all that lawn, and then you've got a garden. And in fact, I don't think you've got much of a garden unless you are paying attention to the shape of the resulting lawn. That is positive and negative space, okay? So here's an example. This used to be a lawn shape in our garden that looked maybe something like a grand piano. It made no sense whatsoever. And so I went out there one day and I proposed to Mary that we put a string to the base of that tree and we go 12 feet this way, 12 feet that way, 12 feet that way, and cut that curve into a semicircle. Then we came 12 times 2, 24 feet up to here, put a stake in the ground, 12 feet, 12 feet, 12 feet, cut that, and now we've got an ellipse. So this beautiful Hikira Nishiki willow is now sitting proudly in an ellipse of lawn. You see it? And the result is that it's articulate. Negative space, the arrow in FedEx, takes on meaning. And so this beautiful shape is a panel on which to set this beautiful little white foliage tree. Okay, Mary. So this is about theme and variation. Think of all the materials you've got in your garden. This is a garden that Dan Snow, a stone wall builder, and I designed. And this is about theme and variation. The theme is this gray stone, and the variation is using it as steps, using it as wall, using it as big stepping stones, using it as smaller steps, creating a curve at the top of a horizontal wall. And the result is unity. That is, theme and variation is a classic element of garden design and of musical composition. Is there water? Is there any water? Excuse me. Oh, there's... Oh, I see. Oh, here we go. Great, thank you. The other thing about this image is that my client, Theodora Berg, and her husband were one of the few people to fly around the Earth on Concorde, and they were in Beijing. And Teddy Berg wanted to have a pair of carved stone dragons. And Peter, her husband, said, who's going to carry them? And Teddy was convinced not to buy them. She was very reluctant to leave them behind. She gets home to New Canaan, Connecticut, goes into Bloomingdale's, and there are the two exact Chinese carved stones for sale at Bloomingdale's. So theme and variation. Okay, Mary. Here's an example. Peonies, that is, in this particular garden, Matilda Brown is painting a painting of a peony garden. That is the theme, and then the variation is all the varieties of peonies to bloom. So this is a wonderful example of theme and variation. Make a whole garden of white flowers, a whole garden of red flowers, a whole garden, whatever the theme might be. What they did in Melbourne, Australia is something very similar to the Ruth Bancroft garden up near San Francisco. Can you see that the choice of stone that they put upright is very similar in color to the trunks of the eucalyptus trees? You see it? So that theme and variation is taking one quality or characteristic in your garden and then varying it in a number of ways. Okay, Mary. So what we've done in our garden, and this may be not on the same style, but what we've got here is yew boxes, and these are yew hedges here, and the yew is here and here. So what we've got is a theme of the yew, shorn yew hedge, but then we vary it in all sorts of different ways throughout the garden. We use black locust posts throughout the garden as steps, but we also have black locust posts upright to send clematis up them. And we have black locust posts holding the far end of our 230-year-old barn vertical. That is, to choose some of try to think this out in your garden. What are the major materials and themes that are in your garden, and then how do you vary them in all sorts of different ways? Okay, Mary. Defining depth is a really fun thing to play with, and you can see that Charles Demuth has simply used, well, not simply, but he's created the number 5 in the foreground, and then as he reduces the size, he creates the illusion of depth. And you can do the same thing in your garden. What Mary and I did here is we've got yew in the foreground. We saw this at Arignac, a garden in the Dordogne, where what they did was they had a 4-foot high and 4-foot thick yew hedge, but then they, when you got 75 or 100 feet into the garden, they put the same shape, but this is only 3 feet 2 inches high and wide. And then we planted another group back here that's only 3 feet, and so it gives the illusion that you see these and you think these are the same size. But so you're playing around with optical illusion. Okay, Mary. So another thing is capturing light. And this is a garden in East Hampton, Long Island, and Daubigny. This is one of the major things that painters pay attention to, and you need to as well. That is, how does light operate in your garden? How does light and shadow work? Can you see that any subject that I've mentioned in this whole garden could be a subject for an hour tour of your garden? And if you do it, you will really begin to see how your garden operates. Okay. Isn't that a beautiful painting of spring in New England? This is Willard Metcalf. But my simple message here is pay attention to light. Okay. And water animates light like nothing else. And you know very well where this photograph was taken. And the next slide is himself. I had an extraordinary experience. I was in Europe traveling for several months on my own in 1974. And it turned out to be the centennial year of the Impressionists. And so I went throughout Europe all the way to Moscow and to the Hermitage, looking at the great paintings held by the great European museums of the Impressionists. And you should see what the Russians have got. But they are painting light, and really, in many ways, you are too. So, okay, Mary. Shadows are one element of light. This is a garden, the Davidson's garden in Bermuda, where Mary and I lectured a couple times. And I'm pointing your attention to that, the shadow of those palm leaves on that white wall. Shadows are amazing things if you can begin to consciously plant with the idea that you'll get certain shadows to do certain things. Okay, Mary. The notion of juxtaposing contrasting textures, forms, and colors points right to the heart of the matter of what gardening is all about. This painting I put on the cover of my book, Art in the Garden, and I put next to it this photograph of Sybil Kreutzberger and Pamela Schwartz garden. These were the two women who Vita Sackville West hired in 1955 to run Sissinghurst for her, and they stayed on for 35 years. Sybil is now 92. She's become a good friend of ours, and I said, is it okay that these two paintings or these two images appear on the cover of my book? And Sybil, who's always got a twinkle in her eye and a joke at the ready, said, yes, so long as we don't have to take our clothes off. So can you see what's going on here? The juxtaposition of contrasting textures and forms is a very big part of what you are doing in your garden. Next slide, Mary. And you'll see up at the Ruth Bancroft garden just what I'm talking about. You know about this, right? I mean, this is the key to gardening around here. And this is a Van Gogh sketch doing the very same thing. But you've got the spiky, and you've got the furry, and you've got the broad cactus. And there's the other theme of gray within all of this. So every plant that you put next to every other plant needs to help one understand the other. It's a good marriage, really. The husband and wife are a wonderful contrasting pair. Okay. This could mean moving plants around your garden. That is, take a sprig of one plant and put it next to the foliage of another plant and see if you see a really interesting contrast of texture. Okay. Okay, next slide. Focal points are very powerful things to hold the center of attention, but what they also are peacemakers. That is, if you've got a section of your garden that feels way too complex, put a focal point in it, a sculpture, an urn, a pot, to settle the whole thing down. Okay, Mary. This is what they did at Sissinghurst. They took this big red pot, a sort of rusty red pot, which picks up the color of the brick, and then they planted the berberis, as well as flowering perennials that throw a color that is similar to that pot. So you can play off of the color of pots in your garden to great effect. Okay. This is a gate we had made based on this Henry Matisse sketch. And what it is theme and variation. That is the spiral in various sizes. Okay. So these focal points, you can go to the next one, Mary. These focal points, this is the Green Man carved in our garden. It was carved by a friend of ours. And having objects in your garden by people who you know and who are good friends of yours is a very satisfying thing to do. But this Green Man is an image, a Druidic image, from 3,000 years ago of the place where man and the world of plants come together. Okay. This is the most beautiful bird bath I know being made today. It comes from Luniform Pots in Sullivan, Maine. They too will ship one to you. These are so beautiful. The line of that bird bath is extraordinary. Okay. I placed a jar in Tennessee, and round it was upon a hill. It made the slovenly wilderness surround that hill. The wilderness rose up to it, and sprawled ground no longer wild. The jar was round upon the ground and tall and of a port in air. It took dominion everywhere. The jar was gray and bare. It did not give of bird or bush like nothing else in Tennessee. You get it? He placed a jar in a field in Tennessee, and instantly everything that had previously been wild found its center in the jar. Everything existed in relation to the jar. So ditto pots in your garden. If you have one area of your garden that you find absolutely stunning, but it lacks a center, put a gorgeous pot that's going to work with all those plants in the middle of that, and your visitor's eye will go to the pot and then comfortably reach out into that space. And it's a very appealing way to approach it. But this is all about how we see things. We're seeing the center of things. Okay, Mary. And this is a very big deal. Gardens are telling your story. That is that plants that you've got in your garden. Do any of you have a peony that was in your grandmother's garden? As we do. But plants that your father or mother or grandparents often used in their own gardens. When we bring those into our gardens, there's that resonance. You just love that resonance. Whether your guests will get it or not doesn't matter. But the fact that you know that your grandmother's peony is in the garden is a very big deal. So that's a storytelling. And what's going on here? Can you see this from the distance you're at? This story being told by Delatour? This is the young prince who's pretty self-assured that he's got his act together, and he's going to stand there and look at you like this. And the four ladies are in the process of picking his pocket. Can you see it? Her job, and it certainly would work with me, is her job is to hold his attention while the pickpocketing is going on right here. And she's looking over saying, "How we doing, girls?" And she's making believe that nothing's going on, but this one is getting the purse. This is John Tradescant, who came in the 1600s, came to America, to Virginia, to Jamestown. And we like to think that this is sort of related to Mary coming to Vermont. Okay, next slide. I need about maybe 5 more minutes. Am I okay? Okay, Mary. All right, I want to close with the color wheel. Sydney Edison is 92. I spoke to her last week, told her that I was going to be showing you this slide, and she wanted to send her welcome to all of you. But she designed this color wheel for gardeners. It is available through the gardenerscolorwheel.com. And this is an extraordinarily helpful thing about color and how to use color in the garden. And basically what she's saying is that color is divided into 2 worlds, the cool and the hot. And by using this wheel, and the wheel comes with all the directions of how you can use the color wheel to manipulate color in your garden to good effect. Okay, next slide. Now, if you're really serious, the Royal Horticultural Society offers boxes of colors, 880 colors. Now, this is the Royal Horticultural Society. This is Chelsea Flower Show. This is England. This is high level gardening. So if you want to create a combination of a blue and a yellow, you just don't go to blue or yellow. You go to blue number 328, and you go to yellow number 73. Whereupon you go mad and decide not to use the color wheel at all. But this is how far you can take the idea of color. Now, I don't know if any of you know Ojai, California. Ariane Aumont had a catering business called Le Picnic. And she has just moved to within a half a mile down the dirt road from us in Vermont with her husband and her little baby boy named Teo. And we visited the other day, and Teo is about this tall, and he was standing for the first time ever. And he just stood there like this with his biggest smile on his face to see what I can do. How was he? Maybe just a few months old. But anyway, what Ariane is doing here is saying, don't forget color wheel when it comes to preparing a meal when you have 5 members of the garden club coming for lunch. That is, she is saying color is so important in the food, in the relationship of the food to the color of the plate, in relation to the color of the tablecloth. She was into all of that, and even goes to the point of creating this herb and spice color wheel. You can have a lot of fun with that. Okay. All right, I'm just going to quickly go through some images of color. This is either side of the color wheel, right? Blue and red. So what you can do is look at the paintings that you've got hanging on your walls, and that will tell you what colors you're interested in. And then maybe there's a way to carry those colors out into your garden. It might be a very conscious way to make color decisions. This is Mabel Choate's garden in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. Isn't that a beautiful blue-white combination? Fletcher Steele had Mabel, who would have been in her 80s at this point, painting the blue in those recesses. I thought this was a beautiful example of Gauguin. You know, any of you could create your own Gauguin garden, for example. You might have a favorite painter, or you might have a painting in your house that you could carry out into the garden and help you to link house to garden. Look at the colors in the walls of your house and how, when standing in a blue room, you might look out at blue flowers combined with other colors that you've got in your furniture. Okay, Mary. Now this is abstract expressionism, and there's an interesting idea here. The abstract expressionists, what they were interested in is a spontaneous variation of color. And if you wanted an abstract expressionist garden, Jim Van Sweden, does this name ring a bell? He was a landscape architect from Washington. He brought grasses into the American garden. Next slide, Mary. This is an example of his work, and this is an abstract expressionist painting and this you could do without any problem at all. Can you see it's just patches of different colors of plants? You're planting 12 of this, and 14 of that, and 7 of this, and you create an abstract expressionist painting by juxtaposing the chartreuse here, and here, and here, and then you put the purple over. You get it? And you can use the abstract expressionist idea to create color combinations. Okay, Mary. And Rosemary Veary in her garden used green to cool. Have any of you seen her garden in England? When this is in bloom, this is a yellow. Help me with the plant. The laburnum walk. It's yellow. Everything is purple when this is yellow. And then both of them go off and they both become green, and the result is that now you've got a very cool garden. Okay, Mary. This is what Mary did with Phlox stolonifera in our spring garden. You see how calming. So, in closing, what this whole lecture is about is your eye. And time, to give yourself time to see, time to use your eyes. It's important to know that 65% of your brain is dedicated to the eye and what it sees. The retina of your eye is literally part of your brain. And so the brain is telling us that vision is key to everything we do as human beings. And so if you respect your eye, use your eye in conscious ways, I think it will change the way you see gardens and paintings and life, really. Thank you very much. Thank you. Uh-huh. Oh, good. Ah, great. Good. Oh, you're welcome. Right. I was. Yes. Oh, did I? Huh? Oh, yeah. Uh-huh. Oh, wonderful. Right. Yes. Yeah.